Hi everyone! In this PowerPoint, we're talking about free-growing damage criteria, specifically related to root disease. This is an area of common confusion, so I'll be covering the difference between forest health reporting and the Netdown process. I'm also going to introduce a newly updated Netdown process, and there's some pretty important changes to be aware of. I'll then cover a handful of scenarios so you can see how they apply in the field. As a reminder, the free-growing damage criteria can be found in the FS660. The FS660 gets updated regularly, about once a year, so make sure you're checking the BC Silviculture Survey's website frequently. If you want to be notified when new versions are released, please join my Silviculture Survey distribution list, and you can do that by emailing silvsurveys@gov.bc.ca. There is a new version for 2026, and it reflects the changes to the Netdown process, so please make sure to download this updated version. Now, if you like to use a field notebook and reference the paper version, I don't think it's necessarily worth the money to purchase the 2026 version if you already have the 2023 version. Instead, I'd encourage you to print off the Netdown process on waterproof paper and tape it into your field notebook or write it out by hand. All right, with that said, we're going to get into forest health reporting. So first, if you have any tree with signs of root disease or a definitive combination of symptoms of root disease, you would not take this tree as free growing. On top of that, you'd record the cause, the tree species, and whether the tree is living or dead. Then, when you're done the survey, you compile these forest health tallies across all plots and report the percent damage for the stratum. And this is what it would look like in results. Now, I need to emphasize a few things. You might have tree species that aren't listed as highly susceptible to root disease, but if they have root disease, you report it. You report all infected trees. The non-susceptible or non-highly susceptible status only applies to Netdowns, which I'll talk about in a few slides. Okay, just a quick reminder, a sign is direct evidence of a pathogen. That includes things like ectotrophic mycelium, rhizomorphs, stain, or fruiting bodies. If you see any of these signs on a tree, you'll need to record the damage agent. And importantly, you wouldn't take that tree as free growing. Now, symptoms are different. They don't give you direct evidence of a pathogen, so you shouldn't rely on them alone. Instead, use symptoms as a flag that something might be wrong, and then dig deeper with a more thorough assessment. So what kind of symptoms can be helpful? So you want to look for resin flow, wood decay and stain. They count as symptoms if you can't directly identify the pathogen off of it. Chlorotic foliage, a thin crown, reduced recent leader growth, and a distressed cone crop. So this photo right here actually shows several of these symptoms. The foliage is noticeably yellow compared to the neighboring trees. There's a distressed cone crop. The crown is thinning. There's fewer needles than what you'd expect. And if you actually flip back to the title slide, you'll see that the leader growth is significantly reduced compared to previous years. So, like I just mentioned, you want to use symptoms as a flag that something is wrong, and then you want to dig deeper. That's because many root disease symptoms are the same as other forest health agents, like drought, root collar weevil, or Swiss needlecast. So for example, this Douglas fir on the left only had yellowing needles, no other visible signs or symptoms when he gave it a quick scan. It was a drier site though, and we've been experiencing drought, so I initially thought the tree was struggling from drought. But when you actually scrape back the soil and can see the roots, the tree had clearly been infected with laminated root disease. The white in this picture is ectotrophic mycelium. Now, if you're confident that your stand isn't dealing with any other forest health factors that would lead to the same symptoms, you still need to look for signs on all your symptomatic trees because there could be multiple root disease types on your site. That's actually a fairly common occurrence. You can even have more than one root disease present on a single tree. In these cases, it's very important that you're closely examining every symptomatic tree. Getting the identification right is important for forest health reporting, but also for your survey and your stalking status determination. We'll get into this next, but it can affect the results of the net down process and your resulting free growing numbers because different root disease types have different highly susceptible species. Now, the only time that you should be relying on a combination of symptoms for identification is when, one, there are no other forest health agents with similar symptoms on site, two, there's only one root disease species present, and three, you've identified the root disease using signs on a different tree. And ideally, that other tree is close by, 1-2 meters away. Having that flexibility is nice. It means that maybe you can target a dead tree for identification versus damaging a living tree. Plus, it's often easier to recognize signs close to the root collar on dead trees versus living trees. You can also minimize damage by following a strategic examination order. So, if my tree has root disease symptoms, I'd start by scraping away the organic layers to expose the mineral soil and the larger roots. I'd then look for surface mycelium, also known as ectotrophic mycelium. It's white or gray, and it can have a crinkly noise to it. It can wrap rocks adjacent to the roots as well. If you find it, it's laminated root disease. If you don't find it, then as your next step, you will need to cut or chop into the tree to look between the bark and the sapwood. You're now looking for that classic mycelial fan of armillaria. Now you'd also move to this next step if your stand has both laminated and armillaria root disease, since they can both affect a single tree. Now if you don't find fans, then you're going to need to actually cut into the sapwood and look for stain. So to do this whole process, you clearly need to have a knife or a hatchet. Whenever you're surveying in a high hazard BEC subzone, it's critical that you're carrying these during your survey. All right, that wraps up forest health reporting. Only trees that have root disease get recorded in the forest health section of your survey card and reported to results. What we're going to talk about for the remainder of this presentation is the root disease net down process. The key thing to note is that net downs only affect your free growing tallies, not your forest health reporting. Through a multiplier, it's a process that reduces the number of trees that can be taken as free growing. This process helps minimize long-term risks because root disease haven't fully expressed themselves at the age that free growing surveys are happening. Root diseases continue to spread, so it's important that we account for that. The net down process is also meant to encourage reforestation with less susceptible species. After all, it's too late to try managing root disease at the free growing stage. It needs to be identified pre-harvest, and then your planting prescription needs to address it. Tying with that, just as a reminder, your stalking standards are meant to address forest health risks. You should not be applying a status quo stalking standard on a stratifiable root disease stratum. You should be applying a root disease specific stalking standard that includes preferred and acceptable species that are less susceptible to root disease and that restricts the use of any highly susceptible or susceptible species without stumping. As I already mentioned, in this video, I'm releasing a new net down process. But before we dive into it, I just want to show you the old wording. We've made changes or provided clarification for anything that's highlighted in blue. So you might want to just pause here and give it a quick read through as a reminder. In the old FS660, the net down process differed for multi-layer stands. So here's a copy of what was in the multi-storied and the DFP Cedrus layered tables. In these tables, the multiplier varied by layer and based on what layer the infected tree or trees were in. It got really, really confusing. All right, next, this is the updated FS660 showing the new root disease net down process. And I hope you'll find it a lot simpler. Pause and give it a read through. So this net down process will apply for all survey types, whether you're surveying a single layer age class 1 stand, or you're doing a multi-entry, DFP, layered, or Cedrus survey. It's consistent across the different damage tables. I'll now walk you through those changes and try to explain why they're happening. Again, all the changes were developed by the provincial pathologists in consultation with survey subject matter experts. So first, they've decided to make the multiplier 2 for all root diseases, all subzones, and all species. That's going to massively simplify this process. The justification for removing the variances for the PP, IDF, and MS is that all root diseases can cause high mortality. If they're present in a plot, the risk is significant, regardless of the Beck hazard. Next, they're keeping the multiplier consistent across all the root disease agents. Before it was 2, except for laminated root disease, where it was then 4. The pathologist thought this was a worthwhile compromise to simplify the system, and thinks risk will be minimized by changing how we count the infected trees in the Netdown process. They've also dropped the multiplier cause specific to cedar and armillaria. The wording was really confusing, so it was being inconsistently applied. For example, no one knew what performing well meant. Some people thought this clause applied for the whole stratum if cedar was present. Other people thought it just applied to plots with cedar. Some people thought the multiplier became 1 just for cedar. Other people thought it became 1 for all species if cedar was present. I'd always interpreted it as 1 for cedar and 2 for all other species. If you did that, it actually led to lower free-growing numbers than if your multiplier was just 2 for all species. Given that confusion and unintended consequence of reducing free-growing numbers, we're getting rid of it. Next, we're aligning the susceptible species list with the BC Managing Root Disease Guide. The previous classifications weren't reflective of the latest research and guidance. Next, we're only going to apply the Netdown process on highly susceptible species. So for some of the root disease agents, this is a significantly reduced number of species. And this is to motivate people to reforest with less susceptible species. Lastly, the whole process had you counting the number of infected, well-spaced trees. This has always caused confusion to new surveyors, and it didn't make sense to the pathologists. The inoculum load is the same in a 399 plot, regardless of their spacing. Therefore, the impact is the same. So going forward, in step 2 of the Netdown process, and I'll show you this in a minute, you're simply counting the infected trees, living and dead. Actually, for tomentosis, there is one more change. Before, you were counting infected stumps. Now you're just counting trees. Okay, I'll now get into the process. To make it efficient, I strongly recommend always starting your data collection with the inventory information and then moving into forest health reporting. If you find a dead tree from root disease, you don't want to immediately jump into the Netdown process. It's far faster to finish assessing all trees against the damage criteria first. That's because in the Netdown process, you will need to identify all infected root disease trees in the plot. You will also need to identify all healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced trees. And to be healthy, the tree needs to meet the damage criteria for all forest health agents. All right, I'll now walk you through the new Netdown process. For the first step, you need to tally the total number of root disease infected trees in the fixed area plot. This includes both living and dead trees at any spacing, in any layer, and of any species. The species susceptibility rankings don't matter. If the tree is infected by root disease, it gets counted. However, we're only counting trees. You don't need to tally infected stumps. Next, for step 2, you need to count the total number of healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced trees in layers 2, 3, and 4 in the fixed area plot, ignoring the M value. That's a lot, I'll break it down. So first, you're only counting well-spaced trees. So that's trees that are a preferred or acceptable species and meet the minimum inter-tree distance specified in the site plan. To be tallied for this step, the trees also need to be healthy, which you can interpret as meeting all free-growing damage criteria. Next, if you're in a multi-layered stand, you're only counting layer 2, 3, or 4 trees, not layer 1 trees. So that's all trees that are less than or equal to 12.5 centimeters DBH, diameter at breast height. And lastly, you're only counting trees that are highly susceptible to the identified root disease agent. This varies based on the root disease type, so it's very important to get your identification correct. This aligns with the ratings in Table 2 of the Managing Root Disease in BC Guidebook. If you haven't read it, check it out. It was published in 2018 and it's filled with tons of great root disease info, and I'll show you that table on the next slide. My last point, you want to make sure to count, when applicable, in excess of the M value. It is very much to your advantage to count all possible well-spaced trees. All right, here's a cut down table showing what species are highly susceptible by root disease type. And these classifications match exactly with the newly updated FS 660. For the third step, you multiply the number of infected trees by the root disease multiplier, which is 2. It's 2 for all listed root disease species in the FS 660 now. That's a change from previous versions, which should make this process far simpler. Then, for the final step, you subtract this number from the number in step 2, which was the total number of well-spaced, highly susceptible layer 2, 3, 4 trees. The result is the maximum number of highly susceptible layer 2, 3, 4 trees that you can count as free growing, assuming they meet all other free growing criteria. Now, if the result is 0 or a negative number, that means that you cannot tally any highly susceptible species as free growing. However, as per usual, you can tally any species that aren't highly susceptible as free growing, assuming they meet all other free growing criteria. All right, for our first example, we have laminated root disease in our plot, so we need to begin the Netdown process. We find 2 living infected trees, 1 fir and 1 larch, and 1 dead infected fir. They're clustered together, all within 2 meters of each other, but that does not matter. For step 1, we have 3 infected trees. For step 2, we need to count the total number of healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced layer 2, 3, and 4 trees in the fixed area plot, disregarding the M value. So right away, the 3 root disease trees are obviously not healthy, so they get X's. Then the subalpine fir isn't a preferred or acceptable species in our stocking standards, so it can't be well spaced, so it gets an X. Then this lodgepole pine is also out because we already recorded unacceptable gall damage on it, X. So now we need to consider what species are highly susceptible to laminated root disease. So if we bounce back to the last table, it's Douglas fir, grand fir, Amabilis fir, and mountain hemlock. In our plot, our remaining trees are Douglas fir, larch, and lodgepole pine, all preferred species. But the pine isn't highly susceptible, so it's going to get an X. And the larch also isn't highly susceptible, so it's going to get an X, despite the fact that we actually have an infected larch tree in our plot. So we just need to examine the Douglas fir. All of them are healthy, except for the 3 with laminated root disease. They're also all well spaced using the 2-meter MITD from the site plan. So in total, that leaves us with 7 healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced layer 2, 3, 4 trees. And you'll note that's higher than the M value, which is definitely to our advantage. Okay, next, step 3. For step 3, we take the number from step 1, which was 3 infected trees, and we multiply it by the root disease multiplier, which is now 2 for all root diseases. So that's 3 times 2 equals 6. Then, for our fourth step, we subtract 6 from 7, which was our well-spaced, healthy, highly susceptible tree count from step 2. That gives us 1. That means we can take, at maximum, 1 highly susceptible tree in layers 2, 3, 4 as free growing, assuming it meets the free growing minimum height, the free growing competition criteria, and they're well spaced from all other well spaced free growing trees, because you will hopefully have free growing trees of the less susceptible species. All right, back to our plot. I now know I can take 1 fir as free growing, but I'm going to wait to pick it. I first want to maximize my selection of less susceptible species. So I know that I have lodgepole pine, subalpine fir, and larch, all as less susceptible species. But like I previously mentioned, the subalpine fir is not preferred or acceptable, and this pine isn't healthy. So I'm left with 2 larch and 1 lodgepole. And they do meet all the free growing criteria, so I'm going to count that as 3. I then can take 1 fir that meets all the free growing criteria. So I have quite a few options, and I'm going to take this one. So in total, that gives us 4 free growing trees in the plot. Okay, for our next example, we're in the CWH XM. The licensee recognized laminated root disease pre-harvest and planted with less susceptible species, cedar and western white pine. Since then, there's been some natural inflow of western hemlock and Douglas fir. We swing our plot and we find 2 trees with laminated root disease. So we start the Netdown process. For step 1, our root disease infected tree tally is 2. For step 2, we need to count the number of healthy, well-spaced, highly susceptible trees. For laminated, Douglas fir, grand fir, amabilis fir, and mountain hemlock are highly susceptible. We only have 1 healthy fir in our plot. We don't have any of the other species. So for step 2, we have 1. Then for step 3, we multiply the number of infected trees by the multiplier, which is 2. So 2 times 2 equals 4. We then subtract this from the number from step 2. So 1 minus 4 gives us negative 3. So that means we can't take any highly susceptible species as free growing. But that's okay. That only eliminates this fir. We can still count any cedar, pine, or hemlock because they're not highly susceptible species. For this plot, we could potentially tally 7 free-growing trees, assuming they're well-spaced, healthy, meet minimum heights, and meet the competition criteria. Okay, for our next example, we have a similar planting prescription, but this plot has both armillaria and laminated root disease. For step 1, you identify 2 Douglas fir with armillaria and 1 Douglas fir with laminated root disease. For step 2, you need to tally the number of healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced trees. To do that, you have to consider the highly susceptible species for both armillaria and laminated. So that's Douglas fir, subalpine fir, spruce, grand fir, amabilis fir, and mountain hemlock. Now, in this plot, the only highly susceptible species are Douglas fir and amabilis fir. We have 1 healthy Douglas fir here, and then there's 2 healthy amabilis firs. They're all adequately spaced from each other, so in total, we have 3 healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced trees. Now, for step 3, we multiply the number of infected trees by the multiplier. So that's 3 times 2, giving us 6. We now subtract that from the total number of healthy, highly susceptible, well-spaced layer 2, 3, 4 trees. So that's 3 minus 6, which gives us negative 3. That means that no highly susceptible layer 2, 3, 4 trees can be taken as free growing. But since we recognized the root disease before harvest and planted less susceptible species, that's okay. We can still tally 7 free growing trees because we have cedar, pine, and hemlock present, and they are not highly susceptible to armillaria or laminated root disease. All right, for our final example, we have a similar species mix again, but this time we have layer 1 trees present. We identify armillaria root disease on 1 understory tree in the fixed area plot. We also identify it on 1 layer 1 tree within the fixed area plot, and 1 L1 tree that is outside the fixed area plot, but was counted in the variable radius plot, swept using a prism. When it comes to reporting the forest health information, both of these layer 1 infected trees will be reported. Layer 1 forest health data collection is entirely based on the variable radius plot. However, when it comes to the Netdown process, you only consider trees within the fixed area plot. So for step 1, There are 2 root disease infected trees within the fixed area plot, and they're both armillaria. So our highly susceptible species are subalpine fir, Douglas fir, and spruce. In this plot, we only have Douglas fir. We have 3 Douglas fir, but only 2 of them are layer 2, 3, or 4. This Douglas fir is layer 1, so we don't count it in this step. While a layer 1 tree can trigger the net down process, layer 1 trees themselves are never netted down. So these 2 understory Douglas fir are both healthy and they meet the MITD from each other. So for step 2, we end up with 2 trees. Then for step 3, we multiply the number of infected trees in the fixed area plot, 2, by the net down multiplier, 2, giving us 4. We then subtract that by the number of healthy, highly susceptible layer 2, 3, 4 well-spaced trees. So that's 2 minus 4 equals -2. That means no highly susceptible layer 2, 3, 4 trees can be taken as free growing. But that's okay. We have 3 white pine, 1 hemlock, 2 cedar, 1 amabilis fir, and a layer 1 Douglas fir that can be taken as free growing, assuming they meet the other free growing criteria. So we could still end up with 8 free growing trees because the foresters were proactive in promoting less susceptible species. Okay, when I originally started recording this training session, I had comparison slides for each example showing how the outcomes and process differ to the old approach. But I decided to cut those slides because I didn't want anyone, especially new start bearers, confusing the old and new processes. So I'll just explain how the results seem to compare at a high level. We tested this process on 3 sites and used more than a dozen simulations. Overall, it will lead to higher free growing numbers. The biggest gains will be when you've planted less susceptible species. For armillaria, you will often end up with higher free growing numbers now because fewer species are being classified as highly susceptible. With laminated, you will also end up with higher numbers because the multiplier has been decreased from 4 to 2. The only time that you won't get higher numbers is if you have multiple infected trees in the plot and you've planted highly susceptible trees. In that case, the net down is doing what it's supposed to do. And overall, I think this new process will achieve what we're hoping for. A simpler, easier to understand process that can be applied consistently and that will motivate foresters to manage for less susceptible species from day one. To wrap up this presentation, I hope you now understand the difference between forest health reporting and the root disease net down process. I also hope the new net down process is clear. We want to simplify the process to ensure consistent application, and we want to encourage good practices from the pre-harvest stage. Like I already mentioned, it's too late to identify root disease and start managing for it at free growing. We need to make sure it's being properly identified and mapped at the pre-harvest stage. The site plan forester must ensure root disease areas are stratified, and then root disease stalking standards should be applied. When they are and less susceptible species are promoted or the site is stumped, then it'll be much easier to achieve free growing now under this new approach. To ensure we're capturing the presence and type of root disease at all stages of stand development, training is paramount. If you or your colleagues don't feel 100% confident on identification or management of root disease, please reach out to your regional pathologist and ask about upcoming training opportunities. If you need their contact information, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. You can contact me at silvsurveys@gov.bc.ca if you have any questions about the survey side of root disease. If you have any questions that require a background in pathology, then please reach out to david.rush@gov.bc.ca. On behalf of the provincial pathologist, he took a leading role in pushing to get this updated. Anyways, I hope this training session was helpful. Thank you so much for accessing this training and happy surveying.